everyone, and welcome to our week on paper writing basics. So for this lecture, we are going to talk about the road to scientific knowledge, which is really taking a bit of a step back and thinking about this project that we're working on the whole semester a bit more holistically. Okay. And then we're going to shift over into an introduction to the literature review. This week, you have no assignments about the literature review. You don't even need to start working on it, nothing like that. But I do want you to have a glimpse of what is coming next after the research question, because this week you're going to be submitting 3 research questions for your project, okay? Now, research questions for research papers. Last week, you submitted 3 possible research questions based off of the documentary, okay? And at the end of this week, you're going to submit 3 research questions that you are interested in pursuing for your research project, okay? And this is all based on the notion that there is some kind of variation in your dependent variable, okay? So if I ask a question like, why do some people vote for Democrats and other people vote for Republicans? I don't advise that question. That is way too broad. But if you say something like that, then you have variation, right? Some people voted for Republicans, some people voted for Democrats. But if you ask the question, why do some people vote Democratic? Question mark. That there's no variation there. That's just Democrats, okay? You have to have some kind of variation in that dependent variable. But next week, when we really jump into literature reviews, you're going to ask, how have people answered your research question? Or maybe nobody has answered it before. Maybe it's just related questions previously, okay? And I will say, other scholars have probably suggested some kind of answer, right? You probably have not reinvented the wheel with your research question, okay? And they have provided this answer in the form of a theory, okay? So if you asked a question like, why have some people voted Democrat and some people voted Republican? A common answer is age, right? There is the general consensus that as you age, you tend to become more conservative. There is obviously a lot of variation and like nuance to this answer. I'm simplifying it, but theories are simplifications of the world. But I want you to think about it this way, is that when you get to the literature review, when you are crafting your research questions, other people have probably weighed in on them in some capacity previously. You're not wading into a discussion that has never been had before, okay? Now, the road to scientific knowledge, right, if theories are answers to questions, right, then you go from, like, this is not just unique to political science, this is how all science works, okay? This is how all science work in the social sciences, in the hard sciences, in political science, right? You have a theory about X causing Y, okay, that's a causal theory. You have a hypothesis that you test, and that's just an expectation about what you will see in your research design. Then you are going to have an empirical test, okay, so maybe you have data, maybe you have case studies, and you evaluate whether your hypothesis was true from that test, okay? And then once you evaluate that hypothesis, you say whether that causal theory, whether you had support for that causal theory. And ideally, you should be contributing to scientific knowledge. So maybe it's a null result where you don't find any support for your causal theory and hypothesis, or maybe you do, right? But in either case, you're contributing to this larger body of scientific knowledge and scholarship. Okay, now I want to be clear here too, the way that scientists, both in the hard sciences and in the social sciences, they deal with data is really different from how politicians or lawyers use information. Okay, and your texts this week do really good jobs of describing, like, hey, this is not how we would approach it in our field, okay? So lawyers tend to advocate for one perspective, typically that of their client, right? And their goal is to convince others of that perspective, right? If there is any new or contradictory evidence, you are going to ignore it or discredit it, but you are not going to include it in your argument. Okay. But if you are a political scientist, if you are a social scientist, if you are a hard scientist, you need to be open-minded about potential outcomes. Okay. You are not advocating for just one perspective like the lawyer or the politician. Okay. Instead, you are looking for the best way to answer a research question. Maybe that's a survey experiment. Maybe that is looking at election data. Okay. And if you find new contradictory evidence, you're usually upfront about it, you're honest about it, and you take it into account and refine your theory. Okay. Now, in any case, like this is very different than a lot of contemporary politics that largely falls into you choose one perspective, you advocate for that one perspective, and you ignore everything else. Okay. Scientists really are fairly comfortable with like nuance and when things don't necessarily work the way you would expect them to, and also being honest about potential limitations. Okay. So you sort of cast away some of your preconceived notions about things and be open-minded to other possibilities. Okay. Now, the default for any kind of scientific inquiry is skepticism. Okay. Now, you can see like this Far Side comic on the right. Most scientists regarded the new streamlined peer review process as quite an improvement, right? And this scientist is going through like all of these other scientists with their new paper. That's because in the sciences, including the social sciences, we are quite strict about what is published, and you go through this anonymous peer review process where people review the paper and they're quite harsh in their critiques. They say things like, I didn't like this method, try this other method. I want to see if the results still hold. I don't trust this data. Where did it get collected from? You get reviewed by other experts in your field, and they tell you whether they think it is sufficient, right, to be published. For instance, like normally it's like 3 reviewers, but it can be up to as many 10. Like I had a friend recently who had 10 reviewers for a paper, and they are typically quite harsh, okay? And hypotheses are only considered as supported if there's very strong evidence in their favor, okay? That's what I mean when all of these other reviewers are looking through your work. They're making sure that your findings, that your data hold up to other kinds of scrutiny, okay? And convincing other scientists can be quite hard, right? If you become an academic, if you go through the peer review process, that is not that's not an activity for thin-skinned people, right? I mean it when I say it's a very harsh process, okay? But the goal is to get new scientific evidence out there, right, that meets a certain bar for what we would accept, okay? Now, if we're starting here with a causal theory, it might help to back up a bit more and think through what's a causal theory. So what's a theory? The goal of political science is to develop and test causal theories about political phenomena, okay? So here, right, it does have to be causal. You can't be like, I think they're going to be correlated, right? It does need to be like X causes Y, okay? And it should theoretically be about political phenomena in the world. Let me be clear, I'm pretty flexible on this. Lots of things are political that aren't like explicitly partisan or anything like that. So I'm fairly flexible on how you define politics here, okay? But what is a theory? It is a tentative conjecture about the causes of a phenomenon, okay? And it links a dependent and independent variable in a causal way, okay? So it's saying X, your independent variable, causes Y, your dependent variable. Now, your independent variable is the cause or the explanation, the thing that catalyzes the change, okay? And your dependent variable is the effect or phenomenon to be explained. So maybe we say something like hot weather causes drought, right? Hot weather is your independent variable. Your dependent variable is the level of drought, right? Maybe I say something like warmer countries tend to cause lower levels of democracy. And in that case, again, the measure is weather, being warm or not. The independent variable is weather there. And then the dependent variable is a democracy score, the level of democracy. Okay, you can also see that illustrated here, right? You're thinking about the independent variable is the thing causing the dependent variable. The independent variable is causing the dependent variable. So what is a theory? So theories should have two main components. They should have a causal statement, X causes Y, right? Warm weather causes declines in democracy, okay? And it should have a causal explanation, right? X causes Y because, right? You need the because in there. So maybe in the case of warm weather, it's something like warmer countries are more prone to conflict because heat is associated with increasing levels of civil wars or something like that. But we do know that warmer temperatures tend to bring out higher levels of conflict in people. Okay, but there can also be different causal explanations as well. And I'll show you an example in a minute. There aren't necessarily you aren't limited to just one causal explanation. Okay, now here is a great example. Late nights partying will cause one to feel terrible the next day. Okay, that's a causal statement. Okay, that's your first causal statement. Late nights partying will cause one to feel terrible the next day. But there are potentially three different mechanisms that this could work through, right? Mechanism one is maybe you drank too much and that leads to feeling terrible the next day, right? Too much drinking leads to feeling terrible the next day. Mechanism two, too little water leads to feeling terrible the next day. Maybe you were out late and you just didn't drink enough water, okay? Mechanism three, if you stay up too late, right, it leads to feeling terrible the next day. Maybe you didn't go out drinking, right? Maybe you just stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning, and the next day you're just really tired, okay? And so there are three possible explanations. You aren't necessarily limited to just one, right? There are potentially multiple mechanisms that this causal statement here, late nights partying will cause one to feeling terrible the next day, right? That's true, right? There are three different pathways that can occur. Okay, here's another one, right? Explosion theory, okay? Higher levels of action in movies cause greater success for a movie, right? If you're familiar with this director on the right, that's Michael Bay, and his movies are just about explosions, okay? And so maybe our causal explanation then is action-packed movies are just more in tune with the taste of today's moviegoers than films in other genres, right? So maybe at this specific moment in time, people are just more motivated to see fun explosion movies, okay? Therefore, that's why they do better at the movies, at the movie theaters, okay? But in any case, what is happening, right, when you move from a theory to a hypothesis, right, you have this theory about the world. The question then is, how do you test it, right? And you have to have some observables here. You have to have some kind of data. You have to have some kind of measurement where you go from the abstraction of your theory to a hypothesis where you test it, right? With data, with measurement. Okay, so this really illustrates what we are talking about, right? You have this independent variable, explosions, right? And then you have this dependent variable, movie success, right? Independent variable of explosions increases movie success. But how are we going to measure explosions? How are we going to measure action? And the same thing is true of the dependent variable. How are we going to measure movie success? And so that's where we get into the hypothesis. And the hypothesis is your independent variable, which is something that's measured, right? It's not an abstract concept. It's some data, some observation from the world. And your dependent variable, some measurement, some data from the world. And you have to shift from these abstract concepts in your theory to your hypothesis, how they're measured. And that is termed operationalization, when you try to measure the concept. Okay, so if we are going to test our hypothesis about explosion theory, okay, so a hypothesis is a testable implication of a theory. We need to put our independent variable and our dependent variable in measurable terms, right? So for our explosion theory, we had, if you recall, the independent variable was explosions or action. An increase in the number of explosions per minute causes an increase in the number of Academy Award nominations, right? So we took our concept of explosions or action and we are measuring it as the number of explosions per minute, okay? And we say that causes an increase in movie success. And here we are measuring that as the number of Academy Award nominations. So success is measured by Academy Award nominations. But there are a ton of different hypotheses that can all be built from your causal statement, okay? So hypothesis 2, maybe instead we say, it doesn't just have to be like explosions, right? It could also be, action itself. So an increase in the number of car chases, so that's how we're measuring like action here, causes a decrease in the number of negative reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. So our dependent variable then is like reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. So there are a variety of different ways that you can take these abstract concepts and then measure them ultimately, okay? Now, your readings gave you the example of economic voting. So what is the theory of economic voting? You should generally know what this is in political science because it's one of the most foundational theories. And it just means the higher economic performance, the better the economic performance, the more likely the incumbent in office is going to stay in office during the next election, the more support they'll get from the electorate. Okay, if you look at presidential elections over the years, what you see is that when the economy is doing well, the incumbent in office is likely to be rewarded, or the incumbent party is likely to be rewarded. And if the economy is doing really badly, the incumbent party is likely to be punished. So if you look at the 2008 election as an example, the economy is doing really terribly in 2008. If you recall, that's the year of the Great Recession. And the Republican Party, because Bush had been in office for 8 years at that point, does not do well in the 2008 election, okay? By contrast, if you look at like 1996, Bill Clinton being in office, right, like his re-election, the incumbent party does pretty well in 1996 because the economy is doing pretty well in 1996. That's because voters are likely to reward the party in power when things are going well, and they're likely going to punish the party in power when things are not going well. Okay, so what would be some relevant hypotheses from this? Okay, so one here is higher GDP growth causes higher vote percentage for the incumbent party. So if GDP is increasing, right, we will see greater support for the incumbent party, perhaps in presidential elections. Okay, and this is a positive relationship because when GDP goes higher, right, the incumbent party vote share is also increasing, right? They're moving together, and that's just like a basic relationship from Algebra 1. Now, you could also have a hypothesis that has a negative relationship, but is still capturing the same fundamental idea. So higher unemployment rates cause lower vote percentages for the incumbent party. Okay, so in this case, unemployment is rising. It's increasing in certain years, right? Like in 2008, unemployment is increasing, right? And then we punish the incumbent party in 2008, okay? So that's where unemployment is rising, but the incumbent party gets a lower percentage of the vote share, okay? But this is still capturing the same fundamental phenomenons, right? Of you have a good economy and it rewards the incumbent. You have a bad economy, it punishes the incumbent. Okay, now I want to just quickly shift over into the research paper and what its requirements are. So just a reminder, it is worth 40% of your grade. Part 1 is going to be the literature review. Part 2, theory and hypothesis. Part 3, research design. Part 4, results. Each of these are worth 5% of your final grade. And then there's the final draft, including introduction, discussion, and conclusion. That is worth 20%. Okay, now the structure of these, I'm going to be super transparent about this. You are going to have 6 sections. You're going to have the introduction, which we're actually going to talk about at the end of the semester. Okay, we're going to have a literature review. We're going to have a theory. We're going to have a research design, we're going to have results, and we're going to have a discussion and conclusion. So that research question, those 3 research questions that you're submitting this week, I'm going to give you feedback on them. You're going to choose one of them, and then you're going to start working on it because you're going to flesh that research question out into a full research paper, okay? And the first part that we're going to work on this semester is the literature review, okay? Now, the purpose of a literature review is to tell the reader what have other smart people said about this topic before you. How have others answered your research question? What are other relevant findings and theories? What's out there? Okay, tell me what other smart people have said. Okay, and you do this through consulting peer-reviewed research. We're going to talk a bit more about that next week when we get into some library workshops, but this is not just like a random Google search where you include news. These need to be scholarly sources that you are using, okay? And like the point, like the quote here from Isaac Newton, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like scientific knowledge accumulates over decades and centuries, even like millennia. And so we look back at what previous people have said, previous scientific studies have said, and we say, well, these very smart people have previously found this, right? And it is relevant to this topic for this reason, right? You don't need to start from scratch. Other people have probably done some of this work already, and fortunately, you get to stand on their shoulders, right? But you have to acknowledge that you're standing on their shoulders. That is what a literature review is. You are acknowledging that other great, smart people have come before you, and you're not merely like a genius who existed in 2025. You're pointing to other people's knowledge as the basis for your advancements. Okay. Now, in a literature review, you are going to be outlining the scholarly debate on your research question. Next week, I'm going to give you some templates that you can use for a literature review, some different ways that they can be set up. And then you're going to section them out into a paragraph here or a paragraph there, and you're going to tell me what are the relevant schools of thought. How many schools of thought are out there, and what does each school of thought argue? So a really common one in like a basic one that I'll just talk about briefly is what effect do voter ID laws have on turnout, particularly among racial and ethnic minorities? And the literature is not clear on this. There are actually 2 camps. It's like one camp is voter ID laws depress turnout, okay? They decrease turnout. And then there is another body of scholarship that says voter ID laws don't do anything. They have no effect on turnout. And then there might even be a third camp that says under certain circumstances, voter ID laws can actually increase turnout. Okay, so that one is quite clear, right? There are three schools of thought. Okay, there are three schools of thought there. Voter ID laws decrease turnout, voter ID laws do nothing to turnout, or voter ID laws increase turnout. Okay, and then at the end of your literature review, you're going to tell me what new knowledge you're bringing to science, right? What gap is there that hasn't been examined yet? So if I'm again doing voter ID laws, right, I might say, like, lay out the camps, just like I said, but maybe the gap is, but nobody has looked at Idaho yet, right? Or nobody has looked at North Carolina in 2024, right? The gap is we haven't answered this part of the question. We haven't answered this question yet. We have this other scientific knowledge that's very close, but it hasn't quite said, like, what effects do voter ID laws have in the Pacific Northwest, right? Nobody knows that yet. Okay. And that's my point here, is like you're trying to identify some kind of gap so that you can answer it. Okay. Now, you are probably familiar with annotated bibliographies. You do not have to submit to me an annotated bibliography, but we find them quite helpful for students, okay? These are sort of like a movie review, right? Where you summarize everything that happened in the article, right? You want to know what the paper's dependent variable is. So as you're collecting sources that you think are really relevant to your research question for your literature review, you really want to be making little summaries about them, okay? And so you're going to want to maybe write down what's the paper's dependent variable, what the paper's independent variable is, what the causal statement or theory is, what's the causal explanation, and then what they find, as well as the citation or bibliographic entry that you're going to use. And then you're going to be making connections to other pieces of literature, other movies that came out this season, right? Like we saw a lot of dramatic films this year, or we saw a lot of explosive movies this year, right? Or maybe there were two kinds of movies that were very popular this year, scary movies and action-packed movies, right? In any case, you're trying to make connections between your different pieces of scholarship that you're reading, okay? In any case, that does mean that you have to read some articles out there. You don't need to get started on it this week, but I am trying to prep you for what's coming. So every time we're sort of rounding out a session, I'm always going to start prepping you for the next part. Okay, and here is a really great example from your text, right? This is an annotated bibliography from Gabriella, right? Her research questions, why are U.S. politics so polarized right now? And what are the policy consequences of polarization? Okay, she says school one is elite extremism, right? And what she means by this, and she says elites are highly polarized and their vitriol alienates many citizens and leads to a breakdown in representation, right? There is a good amount of scholarship that shows that polarization came from elites first in Congress and then the electorate polarized as a consequence. There's not much debate on that issue anymore. I think we're pretty solidly, we solidly know that polarization came from elites in Congress. It did not come from the electorate. And here is the citation from Mo Fiorina and Sam Abrams. They have a couple of pieces here. And Gabriella says, responding to both media characterizations and what they see as incorrect academic readings of the data, Mo Fiorina and colleagues contend that ordinary Americans tend to be comfortably situated in the middle of the ideological spectrum. Elites, on the other hand, occupy the ideological extremes. Thus, the polarized debate in politics is simply a product of elite and media manipulations. Citizens are not always very well informed because they don't pay close attention to politics, and when they are, they don't necessarily have strong, very dislikes or likes, okay? So this is the causal statement here, right? The polarized debate in politics is simply a product of elite and media manipulations. Citizens are not always very well informed because they don't pay close attention to politics, and when they are, they do not necessarily have strong likes or dislikes, okay? In any case, right, you're sort of writing down and taking notes on what the summary of this piece is. And I'm going to give you, like, I know, let me be clear, and Jaleesa from the library will also talk about this. There are shortcuts, there are AI shortcuts for summarizing articles, that kind of thing. But I would also say, like, you should read through it to get just a little bit of granularity, and I'll show you a shortcut next week about how to sort of quickly get through pieces. Okay, in sum, you should have a sense of the general goal of scientific knowledge. This is what you are aiming towards this semester, right? And this is what political science does, is it's trying to advance knowledge on politics, okay? And I'm also trying to, like, the entire paper is obviously connected, right? Like, you can't write a literature review and then, like, write a very different theory and hypothesis. But every single time I'm going to start prepping you at the end of one section, I'm going to start prepping you for the next section. So you also have a sense of what's coming with the literature review. To be clear, that does not mean that you have to do anything with the literature review just yet. Nothing. You have to do nothing with the literature review. You only this week have to submit 3 research questions with their dependent variable and whether they're time series or cross-sectional. But you do need to get a sense of what's coming, right? And that is standing on the shoulders of giants is what comes next, okay? So I'm going to leave us here, and otherwise I will see y'all next week.